It was supposed to be just another Tuesday evening. Colonel David Hayes had just finished one of the best days of his military career. After 20 years of dedicated service, he'd received a special commendation at the regional military base. The ceremony had gone perfectly, and now he was driving home to his family, still wearing his crisp dress uniform with all his medals and ribbons proudly displayed. The autumn sun was setting as David drove through the quiet neighborhoods of Riverside County. He was thinking about his wife and 2 kids waiting for him at home. His daughter had a soccer game tomorrow, and his son needed help with his science project. Simple family moments that meant everything to a man who'd spent years serving his country. David was careful about his driving. 20 years in the military had taught him discipline in everything he did. He always followed traffic rules, kept his speed in check, and made sure his vehicle was properly maintained. That's why he was surprised when he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Officer Ryan Mitchell had been having a rough day. His shift was almost over and he hadn't written many tickets. His supervisor had been on his case lately about meeting quotas. When he spotted the black sedan, something made him decide to pull it over. Maybe it was going a little fast, maybe not. It didn't really matter to him. As David pulled over to the side of the road, he did exactly what he'd taught his own children to do during police stops. He turned off the engine, kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, and waited patiently. He wasn't worried. He hadn't done anything wrong, and he was a decorated military officer. This would just be a quick conversation, maybe a warning at most. Officer Mitchell approached the vehicle with a swagger that suggested he was used to being in control. He tapped on the window with his flashlight, even though it was still light. Outside, David rolled down his window with a polite smile. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Mitchell looked at David for a moment, taking in his appearance. Here was a well-dressed black man in what looked like an expensive car. Something about it rubbed him the wrong way. License and registration. Now, David noticed the officer's tone was unnecessarily harsh, but he remained calm. "Of course, sir. May I ask what I was pulled over for?" "Just get your documents," Mitchell snapped back. David reached slowly into his glove compartment, making sure his movements were clear and visible. He handed over his military ID along with his driver's license and registration. This should have been the moment when everything changed for the better. Mitchell looked at the military ID with obvious irritation rather than respect. Instead of the usual courtesy extended to service members, his expression darkened. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. This caught David off guard. "Sir, is that necessary? I'm happy to answer any questions from right here." "I said get out of the car." David complied, stepping out slowly with his hands visible. As he stood up, his full dress uniform became visible. The ribbons and medals on his chest told the story of 2 decades of honorable service. Combat deployments, leadership awards, commendations for valor. Any reasonable person would have recognized they were dealing with a distinguished military officer. But Mitchell wasn't being reasonable. "What's with the costume?" he sneered, looking at David's uniform. With contempt, David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Sir, this is my military dress uniform. I just came from a ceremony at the base." "Sure you did," Mitchell replied sarcastically. "Where'd you steal this from?" The accusation hit David like a punch to the gut. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting his country, being accused of stealing his own uniform by someone who was supposed to serve and protect the community. "Officer, I can assure you this is my uniform. I'm Colonel David Hayes, stationed at Fort Morrison. You can verify this with a simple phone call." But Mitchell wasn't interested in verification. He was interested in asserting his authority over someone he'd already decided was beneath him. A few cars had started to slow down as they passed by. One driver, a college student named Alex, pulled over about 50 yards away and started recording with his phone. Something about the scene didn't look right to him. Mitchell noticed the gathering attention and became more aggressive. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," he commanded. David's military training kicked in. He knew how to follow orders even when they came from someone who clearly had no respect for his service. He turned around and placed his hands on the roof of his car. "Sir, I've complied with every request. Could you please tell me what law I've supposedly broken?" This question seemed to infuriate Mitchell even more. In his mind, this was a black man questioning his authority, uniform or no uniform. You were speeding and now you're resisting my investigation. Mitchell lied, his voice getting louder. I wasn't resisting anything, officer. I'm simply asking for clarification. David's calm, educated speech pattern seemed to anger Mitchell further. Here was someone who spoke better than he did, carried himself with more dignity than he did, and had clearly accomplished more in life than he had. The uniform made it impossible to ignore. More cars were stopping now. The scene was attracting attention from passers-by who couldn't believe what they were seeing. A decorated military officer being treated like a common criminal for no apparent reason. Alex, still recording from his car, zoomed in to capture the interaction clearly. He could see the medals on the officer's uniform glinting in the evening light. He could hear Mitchell's increasingly hostile tone. Something was very wrong here. Mitchell began searching David's car without permission or probable cause. He threw the contents of the glove compartment onto the road, scattered papers from the center console, and generally made a mess of the vehicle's interior. What are you looking for, officer? David asked, still maintaining his composure despite the humiliating treatment. Drugs, weapons, whatever else you're hiding, Mitchell replied, clearly hoping to find something that would justify his actions. But David's car was spotless. No contraband, no weapons beyond what any military officer might legally carry. Nothing that could justify this treatment. The search turned up nothing, which only seemed to frustrate Mitchell more. He stood up, breathing heavily from his exertions, and stared at David with unconcealed hostility. You think you're better than me because of that fancy uniform, he said, loud enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear. David couldn't stay silent anymore. Not because he was angry, but because someone needed to speak for all the service members who had faced similar treatment. Officer, I don't think. I'm better than anyone. I've spent 20 years serving this country, and I've always treated everyone with respect. I'm just asking for the same courtesy. It was a reasonable request, delivered in a calm, respectful tone. But to Mitchell it sounded like defiance. The crowd of onlookers was growing. Some were recording with their phones now. Word was spreading on social media that something was happening. People were sharing videos and photos in real time. David's wife had been calling his phone, wondering why he was late for dinner. The phone was ringing in his car, but he couldn't answer it while being detained. Mitchell seemed to realize that his actions were being recorded, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. In his mind, he'd gone too far to turn back now. He had to justify his behavior somehow. You're being uncooperative and hostile, he announced loudly, as if trying to create a narrative for the cameras. David looked around at the crowd, then back at Mitchell. Sir, I've been nothing but respectful and cooperative. Everyone here can see that. This was true, and everyone watching knew it. The contrast between David's dignified behavior and Mitchell's aggressive hostility was stark and obvious. The situation had attracted so much attention that other police units were being dispatched to the scene. But instead of de-escalating, Mitchell seemed determined to prove he was in control. As the sun continued to set, the flashing lights from the police car created an almost surreal scene. A decorated war hero, standing beside his car in his dress uniform, being treated like a criminal by someone who had probably never served his country a day in his life. David thought about his children. What would they think if they saw their father being treated this way? What would his fellow soldiers think? What would his community think? But mostly he thought about all the young black men and women in uniform who looked up to him. He had to handle this with dignity, no matter how badly he was being treated. The stage was set for something that would change everything. A simple traffic stop had become a test of character, dignity, and justice, and the whole world was starting to watch. The situation was already tense, but what happened next shocked everyone watching. Officer Mitchell seemed to be looking for any excuse to escalate things further. David Hayes stood by his car, hands visible, speaking calmly and respectfully. To any reasonable observer, he was doing everything right. But Mitchell wasn't being reasonable. I don't like your attitude, Mitchell announced loudly, as if performing for the growing crowd of onlookers. David was genuinely confused. Sir, what? Attitude, I've been nothing but respectful. Don't talk back to me, Mitchell shouted, his face reddening with anger. The crowd watching this unfold couldn't believe what they were seeing. Here was a decorated military officer being yelled at for simply responding to questions. Alex, the college student who had been recording, made sure his phone was capturing everything clearly. David took a deep breath. His military training had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, how to diffuse tense situations, and how to maintain dignity even when facing hostile behavior. He was drawing on all of that training now. "Officer Mitchell," David said, reading the name tag on the officer's uniform. "I understand you have a job to do. I'm happy to cooperate in any way that helps you do that job. But I'd appreciate being treated with basic respect." This reasonable request seemed to enrage Mitchell even further. In his mind, this was a challenge to his authority. He'd convinced himself that David was being uppity and needed to be put in his place. "You don't get to make demands here," Mitchell screamed. By now, several other people had stopped to watch. Some were recording with their phones, others were calling friends and family, telling them to check social media because something crazy was happening on Riverside Avenue. One elderly veteran in the crowd recognized the ribbons and medals on David's uniform. He'd served in Vietnam and knew what those decorations meant. He was horrified by what he was witnessing. "That boy's been to war for us," the veteran whispered to his wife. "This ain't right." David remained standing with his hands visible, his posture straight despite the stress of the situation. He was thinking about his wife and kids at home, probably wondering where he was. He was thinking about his soldiers who looked up to him as an example. He couldn't let them down no matter what. Mitchell began pacing back and forth, his hand resting on his service weapon. The gesture wasn't lost on the crowd, and several people gasped audibly. "Sir," David said quietly, "there's no need for this to escalate. I'm not armed, I'm not resisting, and I'm not threatening you in any way." "I'll decide what's threatening," Mitchell snapped back. The truth was, Mitchell felt threatened, but not by anything David was doing. He felt threatened by what David represented. Here was an educated, accomplished black man in a position of authority and respect. Everything about David's presence challenged Mitchell's worldview and his sense of superiority. David's phone rang again in his car. His wife was getting worried. She knew he should have been home by now, and it wasn't like him to be late without calling. "Can I please answer my phone and let my family know I'm okay?" David asked politely. "No," Mitchell shouted. "You don't move unless I tell you to move." This was getting absurd. David was being treated like a dangerous criminal for the crime of driving while black in a nice car. His military uniform, which should have commanded respect, seemed to be making things worse. Alex, still recording from his car, was live streaming now. Hundreds of people were watching in real time as this scene unfolded. Comments were flooding in, expressing outrage and disbelief. "Someone needs to call this officer's supervisor," someone in the chat wrote. "This is insane. That man is clearly military," wrote another. "This is exactly why we need police reform," added a third. The crowd on the street was getting larger. Some people had gotten out of their cars to get a better view. The scene was attracting attention from blocks away. Mitchell noticed all the cameras pointed in his direction. Instead of reconsidering his actions, he seemed to get more defensive and aggressive. "All of you need to step back," he yelled at the crowd. "This is police business." But nobody moved. They knew they were witnessing something important, something that needed to be documented. David could see that Mitchell was getting more agitated by the minute. His military experience had taught him to recognize when someone was on the edge of doing something they might regret. "Officer Mitchell," David said in the calmest voice he could manage, "why don't we just call your supervisor? I'm sure we can clear this whole thing up with a simple phone call." This suggestion seemed to push Mitchell over the edge. "You don't tell me what to do," he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "I don't care what costume you're wearing or what fake medals you bought online." The accusation that his medals were fake hit David harder than any physical blow could have. Those ribbons represented years of sacrifice, missed birthdays and anniversaries, time away from his family serving his country. Each one told a story of service and sacrifice. "Sir, these medals are not fake. I earned every one of them serving this country." "Shut up," Mitchell yelled. Just shut up with your lies. The crowd was getting restless now. People were calling out, asking why this officer was treating a military hero so badly. Some were demanding that Mitchell's supervisor be called to the scene. David could feel the situation spinning out of control. He'd been in enough tense situations during his military career to recognize when things were about to go very wrong. "Officer, please," David said, his voice still calm, but with a note of urgency. "Let's just take a step back and talk about this, reasonably." But reasonable conversation was no longer possible. Mitchell had worked himself into a state where he saw David's calm demeanor as disrespect, his polite questions as challenges, and his military bearing as arrogance. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Mitchell commanded. "Sir, what am I being arrested for?" "Resisting arrest." The circular logic was obvious to everyone watching. You can't arrest someone for resisting arrest if they weren't being arrested for anything else in the first place. David slowly turned around, still trying to comply and de-escalate, but he couldn't help asking, "Officer, what crime do you believe I've committed?" That question was the last straw for Mitchell. In his mind, David was questioning his authority one too many times. He needed to show everyone who was in charge. Mitchell reached for his taser. The crowd saw what was happening and began shouting warnings. "He's got a taser," someone yelled. "That man didn't do anything." David heard the shouts but couldn't see what was happening behind him. He was still facing away, hands visible, trying to follow Mitchell's confusing and contradictory orders. "Sir, I'm complying with your instructions," David said. "Please tell me what you need me to do." Those were the last words he spoke before Mitchell deployed the taser. The electric shock hit David in the back, sending 50,000 volts through his body. His muscles seized up completely and he fell forward, crashing face first onto the asphalt. The sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed through the suddenly quiet street. For a moment, everyone was stunned into silence. Then the crowd erupted. "Oh, my God," someone screamed. "Call an ambulance," yelled another voice. "You just tasered a war hero," shouted the elderly veteran, his voice breaking with emotion. David lay on the ground, his body still twitching from the electrical shock. His dress uniform was torn and dirty. His medals were scattered on the pavement. The man who had spent 20 years serving and protecting his country was lying helpless on the street, attacked by someone who had sworn to serve and protect the community. Alex's live stream was now being watched by thousands of people. The video was being shared and reshared across every social media platform. Within minutes, "Justice for Colonel" was trending nationally. Mitchell stood over David's prone form, breathing heavily. He seemed to realize that he might have gone too far, but it was too late now. The damage was done. Emergency medical services were called to the scene. David was conscious but disoriented. The taser had left him with burns on his back and scrapes on his face from hitting the pavement. As the paramedics worked on David, the crowd of onlookers grew even larger. People were arriving from all over the neighborhood, drawn by social media posts and word of mouth about what had happened. The video footage showed everything clearly. An unprovoked attack on a decorated military officer who had done nothing wrong. A man in uniform, representing the best of American service, treated like a common criminal and then assaulted for no reason other than the color of his skin. This was the moment that would change everything. The moment when a simple traffic stop became a national incident. The moment when the whole world would see exactly what had happened to Colonel David Hayes on a quiet Tuesday evening in Riverside County. The footage was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. News outlets were picking it up. Military, families were sharing it with outrage. Civil rights organizations were mobilizing. And in Washington, D.C., people in very high places were starting to take notice. By the time the ambulance arrived at the scene, the video had already been viewed over 1 million times. Alex's live stream had captured everything, and the footage was spreading across the internet like wildfire. What had started as one college student recording an unusual traffic stop had become a viral sensation that was reaching people all over the world. David was loaded into the ambulance, still wearing his torn and dirty dress uniform. The paramedics were professional and kind, treating him with the respect that Officer Mitchell had refused to show. One of the EMTs was a veteran herself, and recognized the significance of David's ribbons and medals. "Thank you for your service, sir," she said quietly as she checked his vital signs. "This should never have happened to you." David managed a weak smile. Even in his pain and humiliation, he appreciated the gesture of respect from someone who understood what his uniform meant. Meanwhile, the videos were exploding across every social media platform: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Everywhere people turned, they were seeing the shocking footage of a decorated military officer being tasered by a police officer for no apparent reason. The hashtags started forming immediately. Justice for Colonel, Respect our Veterans, Police Accountability. Within hours, these tags were trending not just locally or nationally, but internationally. Military families were some of the first to share the video widely. They understood better than anyone what David's uniform represented. They knew the sacrifices that went into earning those ribbons and medals. They knew that every person who puts on that uniform deserves basic respect and dignity. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, one of David's fellow officers at Fort Morrison, saw the video when a friend shared it on Facebook. She immediately called the base commander. "Sir, you need to see this video. It's Colonel Hayes. He's been attacked by a police officer." Within an hour, the entire command structure at Fort Morrison was aware of what had happened. Phone calls were made up the chain of command. By midnight, the Pentagon itself was briefed on the incident. The local news stations picked up the story first. Channel 7's evening newscast led with the video, and the anchor could barely contain her shock as she described what viewers were about to see. "We want to warn you that this footage is disturbing," she said before rolling the video. It shows a decorated military officer being tasered by police after what appears to be a routine traffic stop. The video spoke for itself. Viewers could see David's calm, respectful behavior throughout the encounter. They could see Officer Mitchell's increasingly aggressive actions. They could see the moment when a taser was deployed against an unarmed man who was clearly complying with police instructions. By morning, the story had gone national. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and every other major network was running the footage. Talk show hosts were discussing it. Podcast creators were dedicating entire episodes to what had happened. The contrast in the video was stark and undeniable. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, being treated worse than any criminal deserved to be treated. And it was all caught on camera from multiple angles. Veterans organizations across the country began issuing statements. The Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, all condemning what had happened to one of their own. "No veteran should ever be treated this way," read a statement from the VFW National Commander. "Colonel Hayes served this country with honor and distinction. He deserved better from Officer Mitchell, and he deserves justice now." The local police department tried to control the damage with a brief statement saying they were investigating the incident and couldn't comment further. But that weak response only fueled more outrage. People weren't buying the idea that this needed to be investigated. The video showed everything clearly. There was nothing ambiguous about what had happened. Protests began forming outside the Riverside County Police Department by the second day. Veterans showed up in their uniforms, standing in silent solidarity. Civil rights groups brought signs, demanding justice. Local community members who had never protested anything before felt compelled to show their support for David. The crowd outside the police station was diverse in every way except one. They were all united in their outrage over what had happened, young and old, black and white, military and civilian, conservative and liberal. This wasn't a partisan issue. This was about basic human decency and respect. Inside the police station, Chief Robert Sullivan was dealing with the biggest crisis of his career. His phones were ringing constantly, reporters were camping outside. His officers were getting hostile looks from community members they were supposed to serve and protect. Officer Mitchell had been placed on administrative leave immediately, but that wasn't enough to calm the public anger. People wanted him arrested and charged. They wanted accountability, not just a paid vacation. The story was getting international attention now. News outlets in Europe, Asia, and Australia were covering the incident. The video was being shared in dozens of languages. America's treatment of its own military heroes was becoming a global conversation. Social media was playing a huge role in keeping the story alive. Every few hours, another angle of the incident would surface. Someone else who had been at the scene would post their footage. Each new video only confirmed what everyone already knew. David had done nothing wrong, and Mitchell's actions were completely unjustified. Celebrity veterans began weighing in. Actors who had served in the military posted their outrage on Instagram. Musicians with military backgrounds dedicated songs to David during their concerts. Professional athletes took knees during the national anthem to protest what had happened. The military community was especially vocal. Active duty service members, though limited in what they could say publicly, found ways to show their support. Retired officers were less constrained in their criticism of Mitchell's actions. General Patricia Williams, retired from the Army after 30 years of service, appeared on several news programs to discuss the incident. "What I saw in that video was a complete failure of the social contract," she said during one interview. "We ask our military members to serve and sacrifice for this country. In return, they should be able to expect basic respect and dignity from law enforcement." Officer Mitchell failed in that duty spectacularly. The video was being analyzed frame by experts. Use of force specialists pointed out that Mitchell had no justification for deploying his taser. Legal experts discussed the civil rights violations that were clearly visible in the footage. Military experts explained the significance of David's ribbons and medals. Everyone who looked at the evidence came to the same conclusion. This was a clear case of excessive force motivated by racial bias. David was released from the hospital after being treated for his injuries. The taser burns on his back would heal, but the emotional wounds would take much longer. He returned home to find his driveway packed with news vans and his phone ringing constantly. His wife had been fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and supporters all night. Their children were confused and scared by all the attention. This wasn't the kind of fame any family wanted, but David understood that this moment was bigger than just his personal experience. The video had touched a nerve across the country. People were looking to him to be a voice for change, a symbol of dignity in the face of injustice. He decided to hold a press conference on his front lawn, still wearing bandages from his injuries. "I want to thank everyone who has shown support for my family and me during this difficult time," he said, his voice steady despite everything he'd been through. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone. But if my experience can help bring about positive change, then maybe some good can come from this terrible situation." The press conference was carried live on every major network. David's words were measured and thoughtful. Even after being assaulted and humiliated, he spoke with the dignity and grace that had defined his military career. "I don't want this to be about revenge," he continued. "I want it to be about justice. I want it to be about making sure that no other person has to go through what I went through." His words only increased the public support for his cause. Here was a man who had been wronged in the most public way possible, and his response was to call for positive change rather than retribution. The pressure on local officials was becoming enormous. The mayor was getting hundreds of calls a day. The city council was being bombarded with demands for action. Local businesses were threatening to boycott the police department unless something was done. But the real game changer was about to come from Washington, D.C. As the story continued to spread and gain momentum, it was reaching the highest levels of government. Pentagon officials were briefing their superiors. Department of Justice attorneys were taking notes. White House staff members were flagging the incident for senior officials. This was no longer just a local police matter. This was becoming a federal case, and everyone involved was about to learn that attacking a decorated military officer on camera comes with consequences that reach all the way to the top of the American government. The stage was set for an intervention that no one saw coming. David Hayes had been attacked by one police officer, but he was about to be defended by the most powerful people in the country. The morning briefing at the Pentagon started like any other day, but it would end with phone calls that would change everything. Secretary of Defense Rachel Thompson was reviewing the daily intelligence reports when her aide brought in an additional file marked urgent. "Ma'am, you need to see this," the aide said, handing her a tablet with the now famous video queued up. One of our colonels was assaulted by police yesterday. It's all over social media. Secretary Thompson watched the video in stunned silence. She'd seen a lot of things in her years of government service, but this shocked her to her core. Here was one of their own officers in full-dress uniform, being treated like a criminal and then attacked without provocation. "Get me Colonel Hayes' complete service record," she ordered immediately, "and get me the White House Chief of Staff on the phone." Within an hour, Thompson was walking into the Oval Office with a full briefing folder. The president was already aware of the incident. His social media team had flagged it as trending worldwide, but he hadn't yet seen the complete picture. "Mr. President," Thompson began, "we have a serious situation. One of our decorated officers has been assaulted by local police, and it's been captured on video." She handed him David's service record first. 20 years of exemplary service, multiple deployments to combat zones, commendations for leadership, bravery, and dedication. This wasn't just any soldier. This was exactly the kind of officer the military held up as an example to others. Then she showed him the video. The president watched in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When the taser was deployed, he actually flinched. "This is unacceptable," he said quietly. "Completely unacceptable." The chief of staff, who had been taking notes, looked up from his pad. "Sir, this is already a national story. The military community is outraged. Veterans groups are demanding action. This is becoming a major issue." The president stood up and walked to the window overlooking the rose garden. He was thinking about all the military families he'd met, all the soldiers he'd pinned medals on, all the promises he'd made about supporting those who serve. "What's the Justice Department's position on this?" he asked. "They're reviewing it for potential civil rights violations," Thompson replied. "But they're moving slowly, treating it like a standard case." "This is not a standard case," the president said firmly. "This is a decorated military officer being attacked for no reason other than the color of his skin. I want justice to fast-track this investigation." The chief of staff was already making notes. "I'll call the attorney general personally." But the president wasn't done. "I also want to call Colonel Hayes personally. He deserves to know that his government stands behind him." This was unprecedented. Presidents don't typically get involved in individual police misconduct cases. But this wasn't typical. The video had been seen by millions of people around the world. America's reputation was at stake, and more importantly, a principle was at stake. The call to David's home came that afternoon. His wife answered the phone, expecting another reporter or well-wisher. "Mrs. Hayes, this is the White House calling. The president would like to speak with your husband." David was resting in his bedroom, still sore from the taser attack and overwhelmed by all the attention. When his wife told him who was on the phone, he thought she was joking. "Ma'am, this is the President of the United States," came the familiar voice through the phone. "I wanted to call and personally apologize for what happened to you. What that officer did was wrong, and it doesn't represent the values of this country or the respect you've earned through your service." David was speechless for a moment. He'd met presidents before at military functions, but this was different. This was personal. "Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate you taking the time to call. Colonel Hayes, I want you to know that the full weight of the federal government is going to come down on this case. What happened to you was not just an attack on you personally. It was an attack on every person who wears the uniform of this country." The president continued, "I'm directing the Justice Department to prioritize the investigation into Officer Mitchell's actions. I'm also asking the Pentagon to review how we can better protect our service members from this kind of treatment." After the call ended, David sat in his bedroom trying to process what had just happened. The President of the United States had personally called to support him. This case had gone from a local police matter to a national priority in just a few days. The President's involvement changed everything. Within hours, Attorney General Michael Chen announced that the Department of Justice would be launching a comprehensive investigation into the incident, including potential federal civil rights charges against Officer Mitchell. "The Department of Justice takes very seriously any allegations of excessive force by law enforcement," Chen said at a hastily arranged press conference. When that excessive force appears to be motivated by racial bias and is directed at one of our nation's military heroes, we will pursue justice with the full force of federal law. The FBI arrived in Riverside County that same evening. Federal agents began interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, and reviewing all available video footage. This wasn't the slow-moving local investigation that the police department had hoped for. This was a federal priority case with unlimited resources behind it. Officer Mitchell, who had been confident that his department would protect him, suddenly found himself facing federal charges. His union lawyer, who had been preparing for a routine misconduct hearing, was now dealing with FBI agents and federal prosecutors. The local police chief called an emergency meeting with his department's leadership. The pressure from Washington was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. "We have FBI agents crawling all over our department," he told his officers. "The Attorney General of the United States just held a press conference about this case. The president personally called the victim. This is not going away." Some of Mitchell's fellow officers, who might have normally closed ranks to protect one of their own, were distancing themselves from him. The video was too clear, the evidence too overwhelming, and the federal attention too intense. The White House wasn't done applying pressure. Press Secretary Jennifer Martinez used her daily briefing to send a clear message. "The president wants to be absolutely clear," she told the assembled reporters. "Any law enforcement officer who thinks they can assault a member of our military and get away with it is mistaken. We will use every tool at our disposal to ensure justice is served." The international implications were also becoming clear. Foreign news outlets were covering the story as an example of American police brutality and racial injustice. Allied nations were privately expressing concern about how America treated its own military personnel. This was exactly the kind of story that damaged America's reputation abroad. Here was a country that asked other nations to respect its military, while its own police officers were attacking decorated veterans. The Pentagon began its own internal review of how military personnel were treated during police encounters. Secretary Thompson ordered a comprehensive study of incidents involving service members and local law enforcement. "We need to understand if this is an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern," she told her staff. "And we need to develop protocols to protect our people." The military community was watching all of this with intense interest. Social media groups for veterans and active duty personnel were sharing updates about the federal investigation. Military families felt like their government was finally standing up for them. David found himself at the center of a national conversation about police accountability, military service, and racial justice. It wasn't a role he had sought, but it was one he was determined to handle with dignity. He received calls from civil rights leaders, veterans organizations, and members of Congress. Everyone wanted to show their support and hear his story firsthand. But perhaps the most meaningful call came from a young black soldier at Fort Morrison who had seen the video. "Sir," the soldier said, "I just wanted to thank you for how you handled yourself out there. You showed all of us how to maintain our dignity, even when people try to take it away from us." David realized that his experience had become about more than just him. It was about every service member who had faced discrimination, every person who had been treated unfairly by those in authority, every family who worried about their loved one's safety. The federal investigation was moving quickly. FBI agents had interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed hours of video footage, and built a comprehensive case against Officer Mitchell. More importantly, they had uncovered a pattern of problematic behavior. Mitchell had been involved in several previous incidents involving minority citizens. His own body camera footage from other stops showed a pattern of aggressive, discriminatory behavior. The Justice Department was building not just a case against one officer, but a case against a system that had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. Meanwhile, the political pressure was mounting on local officials. The mayor was facing calls for his resignation. The police chief was under investigation for his department's handling of previous complaints against Mitchell. The city council held emergency meetings to discuss the crisis. Local. 6 months after that terrible evening on Riverside Avenue, David Hayes stood in a federal courtroom watching Officer Ryan Mitchell learn his fate. The trial had been swift and decisive. with multiple video angles, dozens of witnesses, and Mitchell's own history of problematic behavior. The federal prosecutors had built an overwhelming case. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges: deprivation of rights under color of law, use of excessive force, and federal hate crime charges. Mitchell sat motionless as the judge read each verdict, finally understanding that his actions had consequences he never imagined. Judge Catherine Williams, a respected federal judge with 30 years on the bench, looked directly at Mitchell as she delivered the sentence. "Officer Mitchell, you took an oath to serve and protect. Instead, you chose to assault a decorated military officer based solely on the color of his skin. You have not only failed in your duty to the community, but you have brought shame upon all the honest, hardworking police officers who do their jobs with integrity every day." The sentence was severe but fair. 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Mitchell would also be permanently banned from working in law enforcement anywhere in the United States. David watched from the gallery, surrounded by his wife and children. He felt no joy in seeing Mitchell's life destroyed, but he felt relief that justice had been served. More importantly, he hoped that this case would prevent other families from going through what his family had endured. The federal investigation had revealed much more than just one bad officer. The FBI had uncovered systemic problems within the Riverside County Police Department. Multiple officers had been found to have patterns of discriminatory behavior. The department's training procedures were outdated, and their complaint process was designed to protect officers rather than seek truth. Police Chief Robert Sullivan had resigned in disgrace after internal emails were discovered, showing he had ignored multiple complaints about Mitchell's behavior over the years. The mayor had also stepped down after it became clear that city leadership had failed to provide proper oversight of the police department. The Department of Justice didn't stop with individual prosecutions. They entered into a consent decree with the city, requiring comprehensive reforms of the entire police department. New training protocols were implemented, focusing specifically on respectful treatment of military personnel and bias-free policing. But the changes went far beyond one city and one state. The incident had sparked a national conversation about how police interact with military personnel. Congress held hearings on the issue, with David himself testifying about his experience. "What happened to me should never happen to anyone," David told the packed hearing room. "But it especially should never happen to someone who has dedicated their life to serving this country. We need to do better." His testimony was compelling and dignified. Even the most conservative members of Congress found themselves agreeing that military personnel deserved better treatment from local law enforcement. The result was bipartisan legislation requiring police departments that receive federal funding to implement specific training on interactions with military personnel. The law also required departments to report any incidents involving service members to the Pentagon and the Department of Justice. The bill was signed into law by the president in a ceremony at the White House, with David and his family in attendance. Today, we're taking concrete steps to ensure that those who serve our country in uniform receive the respect and dignity they deserve from all levels of government, the president said, as he signed the legislation. "Colonel Hayes, your courage in the face of injustice has helped make our country better. But perhaps the most meaningful changes were happening at the grassroots level. Police departments across the country began reviewing their own procedures and training programs. Many implemented new policies specifically addressing interactions with military personnel. The video of David's assault became a training tool used to show officers what not to do. Police academies across the nation now show the footage as part of their curriculum on de-escalation and bias awareness. Veterans organizations partnered with police departments to create better understanding between law enforcement and the military community. Joint training exercises brought officers and veterans together to build mutual respect and understanding. David found himself in an unexpected role as an advocate for reform. He traveled the country speaking to police departments, military units, and community groups about his experience and the lessons it taught. "I don't want anyone to think all police officers are like Officer Mitchell," he would tell audiences. "The vast majority of law enforcement professionals are good people trying to do a difficult job, but we have to be willing to call out and correct the bad actors, because they damage the reputation of everyone else. His message resonated because it came from someone who had been directly harmed but refused to respond with hatred or revenge. Instead, David chose to work for positive change. The military community embraced David as a symbol of dignity under pressure. He received dozens of awards from veterans organizations, not for his combat service, but for his grace in handling a civilian crisis. Young soldiers and officers would approach him at military functions, thanking him for showing them how to maintain their composure and dignity, even in the face of injustice. You showed us that how we respond to adversity is just as important as how we handle success, one young lieutenant told him at a promotion ceremony. David's children, who had been frightened and confused by the initial incident, grew to understand the importance of what their father represented. They learned that sometimes standing up for what's right means accepting burdens you never wanted. His daughter wrote a school essay about her father's experience that went viral on social media. "My dad didn't ask to become famous," she wrote. "He just asked to be treated with respect. When that didn't happen, he showed everyone how to fight for change the right way." The Riverside County Police Department underwent a complete transformation. New leadership implemented comprehensive reforms that became a model for other departments facing similar issues. Officer training was completely overhauled, with emphasis on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation techniques, and respectful interaction with all community members. The complaint process was reformed to ensure transparency and accountability. Most importantly, the department established partnerships with local military bases to build better relationships between law enforcement and the military community. The changes weren't just symbolic. Statistical analysis showed significant improvements in police-community relations, decreased use of force incidents, and better outcomes for all citizens who interacted with the reformed department. Alex, the college student whose phone recording had captured the original incident, was credited with helping bring about nationwide police reform. He received a journalism award for citizen reporting and went on to study law, inspired by the case he had helped expose. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time with a phone camera," he said during his acceptance speech. "But this case taught me that ordinary citizens have a responsibility to document injustice when they see it." The broader impact extended beyond policing. The incident became a case study in business schools, law schools, and public policy programs. It showed how social media could be used to expose wrongdoing and create pressure for meaningful change. Corporate diversity training programs began using the video and David's response as examples of how to maintain professionalism and dignity when facing discrimination. The international impact was also significant. Foreign law enforcement agencies studied the case and the American response to it. Several countries implemented their own reforms based on lessons learned from David's experience. David eventually returned to his normal military duties, but with a new understanding of his role as a leader. He incorporated lessons from his civilian experience into his military training programs, teaching soldiers how to interact with local law enforcement and community members. He also established a foundation to provide legal support for military personnel who face discrimination or mistreatment from civilian authorities. The foundation ensures that service members have resources and advocates when they encounter problems. "No one should have to face this kind of situation alone," David explained when announcing the foundation. "We look out for each other in the military, and that principle should extend to civilian life as well." Years later, when David reflects on that terrible evening that changed his life, he focuses on the positive outcomes rather than the trauma he endured. "I wouldn't want anyone to go through what I went through," he says. "But if my experience helped create a better, more just system for everyone, then maybe it was worth it." The case of Colonel David Hayes became a turning point in American policing. It showed that accountability is possible, that change can happen, and that sometimes it takes one person's courage to make a difference for everyone. Officer Mitchell served his full sentence and was released to a world where his actions had helped create better training, stronger oversight, and more accountability in law enforcement. He never spoke publicly,